Rainer Maria Rilke was an Austrian author born in 1875, who in 1910 published his sole novel, The Notebooks of Malte, Laurids, Brigge. This work displays the psychological concept of Jungian archetypes, including the persona and the shadow. Jungian archetypes, also called psychic archetypes, were developed by Swiss psychiatrist Carl Gustav Jung, who was born the same year as Rilke and published the psychological text, The Archetypes in the Collective Unconscious, in 1959. Jung studied under the renowned Austrian neurologist and founder of psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud, who developed psychological concepts such as the ego and the drives that humans possess. Jung split from Freud to expound upon his own theories, outlining the psychic archetypes as a means of understanding individuals and their drives. We can better understand Malte, the protagonist of Rilke's The Notebooks of Malte, Laurids, Brigge, through the lens of Jungian archetypes. The protagonist embodies a persona, and the shadow archetype appears external to his sense of self. Malte can be understood as an individual who is struggling to integrate his conscious and unconscious mind, experiencing psychological difficulties with his inability to integrate his unconscious with his conscious sense of self. Jung's view of the psyche can be summarized as follows. Psychiatrist Carl Jung stated that an individual's psyche contains three components: the ego, or the conscious mind, the personal unconscious, where suppressed memories are found, and the collective unconscious, composed of shared memories common to all humanity and collective images or symbols, known as archetypes. Archetypes outlined by Jung include the four main symbols: the persona, the shadow, the anima or animus, and the self. The persona outlines how an individual presents themselves in social relationships with others. The shadow is the repressed aspects of personality which remain in the subconscious mind. The anima/animus reflects a gender ideal not expressed externally, a feminine person's repressed masculine traits and a masculine person's repressed feminine traits, for example. The self appears when an individual's ego integrates their conscious and unconscious psyche, representing individuation, self-actualization through the integration of the conscious and unconscious mind into the overall psyche. According to Jung, the symbolic components of an individual's psyche strive for actualization in the context of an individual's environment. Therefore, individuation relies on identification or disidentification with these different psychic components, and environmental pressures encourage or discourage this identification. Furthermore, Jung states that repression of, or disidentification with, certain archetypes may manifest as psychological issues. A repressed archetype may influence an individual's actions and manifest from the unconscious mind in such a way that it is disidentified as part of the overall self, and viewed instead as something external. This observation of Jung's is apparent in Rilke's The Notebooks of Malte, Laurids, Brigge. In Rilke's text, the protagonist, Malte, adopts a persona in the social context of his society, presenting qualities befitting a man of his time. The archetype of the shadow arises from his unconscious mind, as he is plagued by the image of a man in his mirror who feels separate from himself. When this occurs, Malte's persona is challenged by the shadow, which is experienced as something external to himself and which affects his behavior. In Rilke's novel, Malte displays initial identification with the persona archetype. The persona, the way in which an individual presents themselves in social relationships with others, can be symbolized as a mask that we wear in society. Individuals don different masks in different settings, expressing a different persona at work versus with friends versus alone at home. Malte is identified with his persona, which he repeatedly symbolizes through the metaphor of a mask, costume, and disguise. He states, "I came to recognize the very real power that a particular costume can exert. Scarcely had I put on one of these outfits than I had to concede that it had me in its thrall. It dictated my movements, my facial expressions, even the thoughts that occurred to me." Because Malte identifies with his persona archetype, he views this as part of his overall identity, and it controls the way he presents himself. He dons a costume, and through this costume his sense of identity. Malte dons this persona, rather than repressing these qualities as is done with the shadow archetype. He states, "My hand, on which the lace cuff fell and fell again, was not at all my everyday hand. It moved like an actor. Indeed, I might say it observed itself, exaggerated though that sounds. These disguises never went so far as to make me feel a stranger to myself, though. On the contrary, the more my transformations varied, the more convinced I was of my own self." This notion of moving like an actor reinforces the way in which the persona is an act undertaken by an individual, rather than a fully actualized self. This is not the self he is when at home alone, but when donning a mask in social relation with others. Malte acknowledges that his persona varies, wearing different masks for different situations. And he acknowledges that, through the acting out of his persona, he manifests qualities of himself which help him form a sense of who he is as an individual in the world. Malte expresses unrepressed qualities through the persona archetype. He also experiences repressed qualities through the appearance of the shadow archetype. The shadow is the repressed aspect of personality rejected from the persona, and without integration, these aspects remain in the unconscious mind. If the shadow appears, it is experienced as separate from an individual's conscious sense of self. Furthermore, according to Jung, the repressed shadow can unconsciously affect behavior and coincide with psychological difficulties. The shadow archetype is often symbolized by an individual's reflection in a mirror, as this indicates the shadow's disconnect from the conscious sense of self. While Malte identifies with his persona, he has experiences in which the shadow archetype arises from his subconscious, presenting with mirror symbolism and a sense of disconnect. Malte states, "Hot and furious, I rushed to the mirror and, with some difficulty, watched through the mask the working of my hands." At this point, while still identified with his persona, the mask, qualities from his shadow archetype arise, as he looks in the mirror. Although usually embodying a calmer persona, Malte now experiences emotions such as fury in conjunction with the appearance of his usually repressed shadow. As his shadow archetype manifests in the mirror, Malte continues, "But that was exactly what he had been waiting for. His moment of retribution had come." Malte refers to his shadow archetype as he, which outlines the psychological sense of separation between his usual sense of self and his shadow, highlighting the disidentification with his shadow by referring to him as another, not himself. When confronted with his shadow archetype, Malte continues, "While I struggled with a measurelessly mounting sense of trepidation, somehow or other to tear my way free of my disguise, he compelled me, I do not know by what means, to look up." Malte's calm persona has now been overcome with fear as well as fury, and he mentions struggling to rip away his disguise, feeling less identified with his usual costume or persona now that his repressed shadow qualities have arisen. Malte explains that the shadow imposed in me an image, no, a reality, a strange, incomprehensible, monstrous reality, in which I was steeped against my will, for he was now the stronger and I was in the mirror. Malte first refers to the presence of the shadow as an image, mirroring Jung's conception of archetypes as psychic images or symbols. He then refers to the presence of the shadow as reality, as this aspect of his overall self moves from the unconscious, psychic world of images into the conscious mind to become a part of his conscious reality. Malte acknowledges that this psychological shift happens against his will, befitting Jung's assertion that the repression or expression of archetypes happens beyond an individual's conscious control. Once the shadow archetype is presented in the mirror, shifting from an unconscious image to a conscious reality, Malte asserts that he was now the stronger and I was in the mirror. This indicates that Malte has lost his usual persona in the presence of the shadow, but still cannot identify with the shadow, and so still experiences a sense of separation. As the shadow manifests, Malte realizes the strength of the shadow to manifest itself. He was now the stronger. His disconnect from both the shadow and his usual persona in the presence of the shadow is conveyed symbolically with his assertion, "and I was in the mirror." He continues to describe his experience meeting the shadow, stating, "I stared at this great, terrible, unknown figure before me and felt appalled to be alone with him." The shadow is described as an unknown figure which corresponds to the way in which the shadow archetype holds the unknown, or repressed qualities of the overall self. Malte feels appalled to be alone with him, because the qualities of the shadow are repressed expressly because they are distasteful or appalling to the individual. In becoming aware of the shadow via the mirror, Malte expresses the psychological sense that he is no longer identified with his usual persona. But at the selfsame moment that I was thinking this, the very worst happened, and I lost all sense of myself. I simply ceased to exist. For a second, I felt an indescribable, poignant, and futile longing for myself, and then he was the only one who remained. There was nothing but him. There is still a sense of separation between Malte and the shadow, because he still refers to the shadow as him rather than myself. But Malte is unable to integrate the shadow into his usual sense of self, and so he perceives his usual sense of self as ceasing to exist in the presence of the shadow, lamenting that he simply ceased to exist, accompanied by a longing for himself. Malte concludes this meeting with the shadow archetype by trying to run away from it, metaphorically trying to avoid this repressed aspect of his overall self. He states, "I ran, but now he was the one who was running. He bumped into everything. He was unfamiliar with the house, and did not know which way to turn." This outlines the way that the shadow, when unintegrated, can control and affect behavior. Malte continues to emphasize that the shadow is not his usual sense of self, describing the shadow's lack of familiarity with his home. Finally, Malte reconnects with his usual persona when he meets other people in the external world, as the persona is the aspect of self employed in social relation with others. He explains, "He made it down a flight of stairs, and in the passage he stumbled over someone who disentangled herself and called out. A door opened. A number of people emerged from it. Oh, what a relief it was to recognize them. I was crying, but the mask prevented the tears from flowing out, and instead they ran down my face inside it." Back in relation with others, Malte resumes identification with the expression of his persona, indicated again by the symbol of the mask, and with this shift the shadow again recedes into his unconscious mind. Malte experiences relief when his repressed shadow recedes, and he can identify with his persona again without being confronted by the contents of his unconscious. Rilke's protagonist, Malte, can be understood as an individual striving towards self-actualization, integration of his conscious and unconscious mind, but who has not yet reached integration of his unconscious. He is characterized as struggling with psychological issues, a struggle which coincides with attempts to integrate different archetypes into his overall sense of self. This is illustrated by his psychological distress when confronted with the shadow archetype via the mirror, and his relief as the shadow again recedes to his unconscious mind. Therefore, we can better understand the character of Malte in that his psychological issues are linked with his unsuccessful attempts to integrate his unconscious. Malte communicates this struggle within him to integrate and move towards self-actualization. And then came one of those illnesses that had the effect of demonstrating to me that that was not the first experience that was wholly mine. The fever raged within me and dredged up from the deep below experiences, images, facts I had known nothing of. I lay there, surfeited with myself, and waited for the moment when I would be commanded to layer it all back into me, in an orderly fashion, in a proper sequence. I made a start, but it grew beneath my hands. It resisted. It was much too much. Then in a fit of fury, I tossed it all inside me in a heap and crushed it together. But now I couldn't get myself to close up. And then I screamed. Half open as I was, I screamed and screamed. Malte describes his psychological issues as a fever, and his attempts to integrate material from his unconscious mind by describing how he dredged up from the deep below experiences, images, facts I had known nothing of. Again, as when seeing his shadow in the mirror, his use of the term images is notable, as Jung depicts the archetypes in this way. Malte describes integration of unconscious contents by observing that he would need to layer it all back into me, in an orderly fashion, in a proper sequence. Unable to integrate, he again feels fury, and tossed it all inside me in a heap and crushed it together, but now I couldn't get myself to close up. By being unable to properly order his conscious and unconscious mind, he is left half open, unfinished, in psychological distress, his psyche in disarray. Therefore, Malte can be understood as a character unable to achieve this integration of his overall psyche, unable to reach individuation or self-actualization.